President Trump is cutting short, as we just mentioned there, the G7 summit in Canada, hours after he took to social media to call for the evacuation of Iran's capital, Tehran.
President, any statement on why you're leaving the G7 early for Washington?
Well, I have to be back. Very important.
Let's bring in our panel now, our team, really. Bloomberg desk editor Jill Deeses, joining us from the G7 summit as well, is our Bloomberg correspondent David Gura. Jill, I'll start with you. On the latest in Iran, we're hearing that there might be some more missiles going through this morning as well. It doesn't seem like day 5 we're hearing much different.
No, I mean, I think at this point it seems pretty clear that this may become a conflict that lasts not just days, but potentially weeks. You did obviously have that statement from Trump just a couple of hours ago, saying that people in Tehran should evacuate. Now, again, it's not. This is a city of 9 million people. It's not clear whether Trump has any sort of special insight into whether there's additional fresh attacks from Israel. But I think again at this point it just seems incredibly clear that this is an evolving conflict. You did have the White House press secretary come out and say that part of the reason, or the reason why Donald Trump was leaving the G7 summit early was because of matters in the Middle East. So clearly, some sort of threats of further escalation here. We'll have to see how this continues to unfold. But it does seem very significant, obviously, that Trump is leaving this meeting and heading back to Washington.
Yeah, David Gura, I'll bring you in. You're in Canada, where we understand that the U.S. president, before he heads back, is, and correct if I'm wrong, still having dinner. But he is headed back to Washington immediately after that. Stitch together the story in Israel-Iran for us and why he is headed back. What do we know about that? What does his schedule look like, David?
And just to pick up on what Jill was saying, that was such an extraordinary moment when that post came out. We kind of looked at each other and wondered what he was referring to. We still don't have a very clear answer about why he issued that warning. But just looking over the course of the day, there was a lot of conversation about a path forward with Israel and Iran. There was an effort by the leaders of the G7, absent the U.S., to kind of come to some sort of unified agreement to tell those two countries to de-escalate, to stress the importance of doing that. President Trump did not want to be party to that agreement and had the opportunity to talk a bit about why he thought that's the case. He began to push once again for there being a diplomatic solution, said that Iran is effectively at the table because it has no other options. And then he took questions before he issued that statement on Truth Social. He was side by side with Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, talked again about diplomacy, talked again about the seriousness of the situation. And then it wasn't long after we got that post that we heard from Caroline Leavitt, the president's press secretary, that he intended to leave early. And we understand there were many members of other delegations who found out about that through the media, not through official channels. So it did take people here by surprise. Unlike back in 2018 when President Trump left that G7 in Charlevoix, Canada, early, it wasn't apparently out of any sort of pique or anger toward the group or the institution. He said, as he said during the family photograph moment, that he has to get back, he has to deal with what's going on, and Caroline Leavitt underscoring it has to do with the Middle East. So it just raises a series of questions. Does that signal that the U.S. is bound to get more involved in this conflict? And President Trump and his administration so far have taken a back seat, said they didn't want to get involved. Are things going to change, or is he going to have some sort of hand here in trying to broker a temporary peace or a ceasefire in this crisis?
Yeah, that was what our oil markets were a bit relieved about, that Iran still wants to continue with these nuclear talks, Jill.
Yes, I mean, certainly that's what Iran is saying here. And I think also to David's point, you have had several officials within the Trump administration pushing back against reports that they're escalating U.S. military involvement, saying that the defensive posture that the United States is they're saying it's, maintained there. I think there has been a little bit of confusion over how exactly Trump would like to get involved. Over the past couple of days, you've had somewhat conflicting statements where, he's obviously, as David has pointed out, Trump has been saying that, he wants them to pursue a deal, saying that that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. It's in their best interest to come to the table, but also at the same time, some sort of, in a different way, sort of backing, this idea that, Israel is continuing with this kind of escalation, as David just mentioned there, the idea that Trump's not backing the broader, G7 statements about this. So I do think that does raise a bit of confusion there. But again, I think all just, pointing to the fact that Trump at least sees this as something that he needs to be back in Washington to ultimately deal with. And so we'll have to see how that eventually escalates. But again, yes, I do think significant that at least for now, the Trump administration is, saying that, this is still sort of a defensive posture from the United States.